In 1943, thousands of Shermans fought in North Africa and on the Eastern Front. They performed well and became worthy opponents of the German Panzer IIIs and IVs. But when faced with Tiger I's, the designers were forced to make radical improvements to the M4. The frontal armour of the Tiger I is 100mm thick. Now, to penetrate this at a distance of 1,000 metres, you need an extremely powerful gun. And the British had just such a gun, and this is the 17-pounder. But it was not easy to install such a big gun on the tank. Because of its size and weight, the gun would simply not fit on any British tanks at that time. At first, British designers wanted to make a new tank, but the development of a new vehicle was a lengthy process. Then they decided it was better to modernise the British Cromwell, and so was born Project Challenger. However, due to various technical problems, the serial production of the Challenger began only in 1943, and the British tank industry could not produce sufficient amounts of Challengers quickly enough. Meanwhile, the army could not wait. The Allies were preparing to land in Normandy, and they needed a tank to face the German heavy tanks, and they needed it now. By 1943, there were already a lot of Shermans in the British Army. They were well established and reliable. Naturally, the British wanted to install the best British anti-tank gun into this American tank. Major George Brighty was the Royal Tank Regiment officer who championed the idea. He was confident that the Sherman was better suited to the 17-pounder gun. But to install it, it was necessary to solve the main problem: how to fit such a gun with the very long recoil into the small turret of the Sherman. At first, Brighty proposed to solve the recoil problem in an original way, by locking the gun in place and to force the entire tank to absorb the recoil. These tests were generally successful, but it became clear that the system would quickly lead to a breakdown of the turret mechanisms. It was at this stage that Lieutenant Colonel Witheridge joined him. George Witheridge, until that year, had been in the United States as a military consultant and had become thoroughly acquainted with the capabilities of the American tanks. Thanks to the support of Witheridge, the project of installing the 17-pounder on the Sherman was taken on by professional designers. This project was assigned to an engineer of the Vickers Company, W.G.K. Kilbourne. The main problem was the size of the gun, but in particular the recoil of the gun. The recoil of the 17-pounder was a massive 1 metre. Kilbourne decided not to modify the recoil system, but to completely redesign it. The recoil cylinders were shortened and were placed on both sides of the gun to take advantage of the width of the Sherman's turret rather than be hindered by its height. The shells of the 17-pounder were heavier and larger than the shells of the standard 75mm gun. And here is one of the rounds for the 17-pounder, and you can see what a size it is. It must have been an absolute nightmare to manhandle it around this very small turret and then load it into the breech. The next problem was the gun cradle being too large. Kilbourne shortened it, but to keep the gun firmly in the turret, he developed a new mantlet and a new gun barrel. Also, to make more room in the turret, he took the radio out of the tank and placed it outside the turret in a specially armoured box. This box is perhaps the most characteristic feature that you will see on the Firefly. Another significant change in the Sherman was getting rid of the co-driver and dismantling the hull-mounted machine gun. The Firefly crew, compared with Sherman, decreased from 5 to 4 people, and the vacant place was occupied by ammunition, 77 rounds in total. Thanks to the engineering finds of Kilbourne, the British were able to install one of the most powerful tank guns during the war into the small Sherman turret. This gun had a higher armour penetration than the guns of the Tiger and the Panther. The Firefly's gun could penetrate 163mm of armour at a distance of 500 metres, and 150mm at a distance of 1,000 metres, with a standard armoured piercing projectile. This was enough to penetrate both the Tiger and the Panther in the front armour at decent distances. The penetration of the APDS, the armoured piercing discarding sabot, was even higher, 256mm at a distance of 500 metres, and 233mm at 1,000 metres. In theory, almost any German tank of that period could have been penetrated with these shells. But in practice, these shells were not accurate because of their shape. Therefore, the crews used them infrequently. But the 17-pounder gun had its problems. Its powerful shot raised a cloud of dust and dirt, obscuring the gunner's vision. He could therefore only adjust fire with the help of the commander. The second problem was the very bright muzzle flash, which meant that unless the gunner and the commander momentarily closed their eyes prior to firing, they would actually be blinded and therefore couldn't even see the fall of shot. Secondly, a bright muzzle flash gave away the tank's position. Despite these drawbacks, Firefly became one of the best tanks of the Second World War and played a significant role in the liberation of Europe. The first Fireflies were ready for the landings in Normandy, and perhaps this fact ensured the success of the Allied operation. Since initial intelligence underestimated the number of Tigers and Panthers in Normandy, without Firefly it would have been difficult for the original Shermans to fight the German tanks. Their 75mm gun was effective only when the Sherman engaged in the side, and at a distance of less than 500 meters. To strengthen the tank troops and give them the opportunity to fight the German tanks, the British supplied each tank platoon with 2 Fireflies. German crews quickly realized the great danger of these new Shermans with the long barrels, and Firefly became the prime target of German tanks and anti-tank guns. Firefly's armor did not change much compared to the original Sherman, so it was very vulnerable. Therefore, in order to carry less losses, the crews of the Firefly came up with many ingenious ways to hide the long gun. They painted the outer half of the gun a lighter color and fitted a false muzzle brake around the gun at the point where it changed color. Another disguise was hiding the long gun by traversing the turret over the back decks and then fitting a dummy 75mm tube to the rear of the turret. But these proved ineffective. What was needed was a complete rethink of the tank's tactics. Original Shermans attacked first, and Fireflies were behind and covered the Allies. This tactic proved to be quite successful. Despite their great losses, the Allies were confidently advancing on Berlin, and one of the main roles in this successful exploitation was played by the Sherman Firefly. Initially, the Americans did not want to install a gun with high armor penetration, but after the big losses in northern France, they realized their mistake and began urgent improvements on the M4. They fitted a 76mm gun, and also improved the stowage and suspension, but more about that later.